Good evening. I'd like to call to order the special meeting of the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Commission. The commission meetings have reopened for the public in person effective July 2021. Face coverings are required for members of the public who enter the city buildings regardless of vaccination status. Commissioners will be participating from the council chamber. Public comments can be made either in person or remotely via Zoom. Please refer to the end of the agenda to review options for participating in the meeting or the city website if you'd like instructions on how to call in. Secretary Ballinger, can you please call to order?
Yes. Commissioner Garland?
Here.
Commissioner Oler?
Here.
Vice Chair Kearsley?
Here.
And Chair Davenport?
Here.
And let the record show that Commissioner Moran could not be here tonight.
And I just want to make an announcement about public communications. This portion of the meeting is reserved for comment on items for consideration only. Under the Brown Act, the Commission cannot act on items raised during public communications, but they may respond briefly to statements made, questions posed, request clarification, or refer the item to staff. As this is a special meeting, we'll only be taking comments about the Your Parks, Your Future location of the future combined facility at Heather Farm Park, and we will be taking those questions after the staff report. So at this time, I'd like to invite staff to give us their report on the item for consideration.
Good evening, Chair Davenport and PROS commissioners. My name is Janine Cavalli, and I am managing the Your Parks, Your Future project, which is a combined effort with the Arts and Recreation Department and Public Works Department. I'm joined this evening by two members of our consultant team, Leah Martinson with Nolan Tam Architects and Alice Miller with RRM Design Group. And we also have a couple of consultants on Zoom if needed to answer questions. And then we also have our city working group that's here with us tonight. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is to receive an update on the Your Parks, Your Future project, namely to summarize the outcomes of our Phase 1 work, and then to present to you the Phase 1 implementation work plan, so implementing the outcomes from Phase 1. Then we'll review the existing conditions at Heather Farm Park to provide some context for our discussion on the future site options for a combined pool or swim center and community center facility at Heather Farm Park. And we'll be asking for your feedback on those three options this evening. So the Your Parks, Your Future project began back in 2018 as council had asked city staff to look into renovating or replacing our critical facilities that were reaching the end of their useful life. And those four facilities were the community center and swim center at Heather Farm Park, the Assembly Hall at Civic Park, and the Shaylins Arts Center. So we began Phase 1 in 2018, focusing on the buildings and the programming that occurred in those facilities, understanding that Phase 2 would occur later, focusing on the outdoor spaces at Heather Farm Park and Civic Park. So we concluded Phase 1 in February of 2020 with council direction. And the council direction is also summarized here on the slide. Their direction was to prioritize the implementation of the Heather Farm facilities, including Clark Swim Center and Community Center, and to co-locate and combine those facilities into one. And also to consider both lap pool size options at the 25-meter and 50-meter size. So all of the options that you see before you tonight can accommodate either of those lap pool sizes. So next, I'll summarize for you the work plan for this next set of work that we will be doing. One of the first things we did was to determine a study area for where this combined and co-located future facility would be within the park. And that's illustrated here in the yellow shaded area. And that yellow shaded area includes both the existing swim center, the existing community center, and some adjacent areas. And what it excludes is the All Abilities playground. That was one of a number of items identified at the beginning of the project for facilities or amenities that should remain in place. And so that's why it's excluded from the study area of where a future facility could be located. So this slide identifies the outline of our work plan over this next several months, beginning with the location of the future facility, which is the purpose of our meeting this evening. The next item, staff is working with the Walnut Creek Aquatics Foundation to determine an amount that could be applied towards or raised towards a 50-meter pool and the associated bathhouse. The third item, the funding strategy, that's a little bit separate than, but simultaneous work than the work that I'm presenting to you tonight. The work that this team is working on is the design of the facility. The funding strategy is another effort to determine how that facility would be funded, and our city manager's office is leading that effort. And then lastly, the facility design. So once we have the location of the facility, we'll work on a more conceptual design of the building and the associated outdoor spaces and the pools. And that work will begin in December and conclude in June of next year. And the design will also address any outdoor spaces that are created if or when one of the existing facilities is relocated. So I'm now going to hand it over to our consultant, Leah Martinson, and she'll be giving you some context of Heather Farm Park to help set the stage and better understand some of the constraints and opportunities when determining where a future facility could be located.
Hello, thanks for having us here. I'm going to go through the existing conditions relatively quickly to kind of give you a sense of the constraints that we're talking about when we're trying to compare different options, and then we'll go into more detail when we get to the possible site options. So starting looking at the programmed areas on site, this identifies some of the areas, the outdoor spaces that have designated programs, from the gardens to the playground to the picnic area, and of course the ball fields. And what's not shown is, of course, all the passive uses that are in that sort of surrounding white area that are also important to the function of Heather Farms Park. This is the location, showing the location of the existing buildings, the community center in red and the aquatic center and pool in blues. And then both of those, to note, have sort of associated outdoor areas, the event space for the community center and the surrounding spectator area for the pool. And those are spaces that we're taking into account and want to make sure that any new facility will also accommodate. We know that parking and circulation is an issue, so this is sort of looking at the spread of parking in blue along Heather Farm and also identifying some of the key pedestrian circulation through the park. And kind of a key thing to note is the walking path around the outside of the pond, which is a major use element, and the connections between those spaces and the gardens and the playground in that sort of study area. And then we know that noise and both separation from and generation of noise is a concern. So this is identifying some of the key noise generating activities that are currently in the park, and that includes obviously the existing swim center, the playground, and the picnic area. And it also notes some of the areas that are more sensitive to noise, specifically the residential areas adjacent and the gardens where that want to be separated from noise for their event activities. Also, sort of the slide is combining a couple of things. We know that views are really important, so the sort of orange highlights are showing the critical views mostly towards the pond, since that's an iconic feature of the park. And it's really important that the picnic area, the community center, and the gardens all maintain those views to the ponds. And then also noting the importance of the outdoor area operating as a spectator area for the pool, and the views from these outdoor areas into the pool is also key consideration. So this is kind of overlay of everything. Can kind of see everything that's going on, and it's a pretty busy study area that we're looking at. So should I just keep? So thinking about the potential future facility site options, we're looking at, or we've been directed to look at 3 discrete locations. So the first one would be on the location of the existing community center. The second one would be on the location of the existing pool and aquatic center. And then the third one is in that intermediate park area in the middle. So for all 3 options, to try and compare apples to apples, we're looking at pretty consistent facility components for the buildings and the site. So this is still highly diagrammatic. It's accurate in terms of sizes and relationships, but the specific design of the facility and also the pool, obviously, is yet to come. So roughly, we're looking at a combined facility that has a wing for the community center functions and events, and then a wing for the aquatic center. There's, again, that associated outdoor area for events associated with the community center, and for sort of spectator spillover area that would be associated with the pool. We want to make sure that they have both a service entry and a main entry, probably a shared lobby between the 2 parts of the space. And we also want to make sure that the site can accommodate some amount of additional parking. Since the facility will be slightly larger than the existing facilities, we know there's going to need some slight increase in parking. And exactly what amount that is something that'll have to be negotiated as we get further down the road. So just since it comes up all the time, there is space for expanded parking for all 3 of the site options, and these are some of the places that we might think about locating some or all of this parking in the future. But again, that's a little bit down the road. So in terms of cost, again, to emphasize that we are at a pretty early stage in figuring this out. So the cost for the building components, so basically walls, roof, floors, all the spaces that are going to enclose program, are going to be roughly the same for all 3 site options. The buildings are the same size, they'll be the same level of construction. The variations in site are where we're going to see potential increases in cost. So if we have to bring new utilities to the site, that'll be a slight site cost increase. If the site requires a more extensive site preparation, like grading and excavation, that's going to be an additional cost. And then if we impact the pond in any sort of significant way, it's likely that will cause increased costs too. And then I will note, all of these options that we're going to show you assume a single-story building, and a single-story building fits in all 3 of those sites. But if there was a reason down the road that we decided to have a 2-story building, that would also be an increased cost factor. So as part of this phase of the process, we met with a number of different stakeholder groups, and those are listed up on the screen. So we met with representatives from the gardens at Heather Farm Park, the Mount Diablo Audubon Society, the Walnut Creek Aquatic Foundation, the Aquanauts, Masters, Aquabears, and Swim Club, as well as the Walnut Creek Chamber of Commerce. And we have we'll highlight some of their specific concerns, but we wanted to make sure that we were addressing any of their particular areas of interest as we did the site analysis. Some of the key things that these groups noted were really the importance of the views through the park, which we talked about earlier, and that's both views into from the street and then views across the park from the different program areas. there was a real emphasis on making sure that the facilities are right sized to support both the current programming and then also possible future uses that would be benefit the city in a new facility. There's a lot of emphasis on maintaining the pond as a location for the current recreational activities, both the sort of passive walking uses as well as for fishing and photographs and views. And then a lot of concern about minimizing noise impacts on sensitive areas and also minimizing the construction impact, particularly minimizing facility closure was a big concern. So again, just to reemphasize Janine's point, we think that all three of the sites are feasible. They all fit the program, they all fit parking, they will all work. We evaluated the three, and we'll get into this in detail in terms of building configuration, how flexible and how many options might be available, how constrained or not constrained the site might be. In terms of adjacencies, so what kind of opportunities are presented, both good and bad, if we locate the building in one of the particular locations. How a new facility might impact access, and both pedestrian and vehicular, and then also opportunities for parking. And what effect there might be on phasing and operations of the facility, particularly during construction, and then what factors we see that might be cost factors that might increase or minimize the cost at constructing at any particular site. I'm going to pause for a moment. So with that, I will start with the first site option is looking at locating a facility in the existing swim center site. So, so again, sort of diagrammatic, it fits it in a little T, and then there's the outdoor space around the pool deck and an outdoor space for events sort of between the garden and the community center. And then thinking about the analysis of this. So in terms of building configuration, this is probably the least flexible site. It's constrained by the gardens, by the road, and by the topography. So it will be challenging to fit both a larger building facility and the adjacent site uses all gracefully in that site area, although it is possible. And it's going to be more limited, the type of outdoor spaces, adjacent outdoor spaces that we can really develop. In terms of adjacencies, a big downside is that the community center and the event room will really lose their connection to the pond. It's quite separate from that. And it's likely that the picnic area will be impacted and might need to move or shift in this location. There's also a concern that this really consolidates a lot of the noise generating uses in this corner of the site right next to the gardens. So the pool and the picnic area are going to be right here, right with the event space associated with the community center. In terms of operations and phasing, the biggest item is obviously that it would require closure of the swim center for the whole duration of construction. And that'll really impact the programming. The community center would be able to remain open, but it would impact all the aquatic programming. However, potential benefit is that there would be limited additional excavation and wouldn't be required, and the utilities for both the pool and the community center are already available on site. So some of the input that we got from the stakeholders about this site was that closing the swim center would be problematic for the functions there, and that was going to have a big impact. They were also concerned about noise, and there was a lot of concern about that loss of connection and views from the community center towards the pond. So the second option is looking at the community center site, and so this sort of takes over the existing community center, maintains the relationship of the existing community center to the pond and those views out, and lets the aquatic center and pools have a relationship to the currently open area and the street and the playground. In terms of this option, in terms of building configuration, this is probably the most flexible site. There's a lot of different ways that we could configure the building. We're showing obviously one diagrammatic option, but it's possible that it could be more of a T or an L shape, and the pools could be on either side of the building. There's a lot of elbow room for the building itself and the pools to have the optimum relationship as we get further down into design. So in terms of adjacencies, I mentioned the pond view, and so the community center does maintain that great connection to the pond, and we could make a really lovely outdoor area that really emphasizes that connection from the event space. It allows views of the pool from the playground, which really creates that family-friendly connection. And the noise sources, primarily picnic and swim, can be organized so that they're further away from the garden, and we could organize the building and the site so that they're separated from the event space in the community center. In terms of access and circulation, it is pretty centrally located. I think there's a big benefit in that this shared facility, which is going to have higher intensity of use, is located right across the street from a lot of existing parking. So you sort of have a built-in overflow parking already in this configuration. And it allows pedestrian access through the site in the way that it exists currently. That doesn't impact those connections across and around the pond. In terms of operation and phasing, the swim center would remain open, although obviously the community center would have to close during construction, and that has an impact for the programming that's currently happening there. It would need to be relocated or paused during construction. I think, again, in part because of its location right on the street, there's a lot of good opportunities for construction staging here, which is going to help with logistics for the contractor. And it's always good if the contractors don't have to do something crazy, because then their prices are not quite as high. So in terms of cost factors, other cost factors, there will be some amount of new utilities required since the pool is a more intensive use than the existing community center. And there'll be a little bit more excavation required, obviously, because we're relocating the pool. Some of the stakeholder feedback that we got about this option was, if this were just selected and this went further on, we'd really want to consider how the facility presents itself, whether the front door is really on the street or whether the front door is more towards the pond. So consider how the facility is oriented to maximize the view corridors both within the site and from the street. And then there's also an interest in making sure that there's a really strong noise separation between the pool functions and the community center functions, which I think would be applicable for pretty much all of the sites as well. That would be a facility design item that we'd want to take into account. So the final site is this sort of intermediate park site located between the existing community center and the existing swim center. And it sort of locates, we're showing it as a T configuration, and it gives the community center a great pond outdoor area to the north, separated from the pool on the south, and its associated outdoor areas. And in terms of the analysis here, this is, it accommodates all of the outdoor program, and it, I think, allows some opportunities for creating really lovely adjacent spaces. It is a pretty constrained site because we're trying to fit it in between the two existing buildings. So there's a fair amount of, there's not quite as much elbow room, and it's very possible that it might end up impacting the picnic area or the parking at the existing swim center in order to fit the building in without touching the existing buildings. So in terms of adjacencies, we'd need to make sure that the pond and the pool had a buffer between them. So that's, again, something that would sort of constrain the site on the pond side as well. And as I mentioned, it's likely that this one would have the most impact to that picnic area and parking. In terms of access and circulation, it is really centrally located, and it would allow, since it's right in the middle, you could have people park on either side to use the facility, and that gives you a big benefit if people are coming in for different uses to separate out those access points. Again, there's additional parking relatively easily available on either side of the site. However, locating a building sort of right here on the edge of the pond would really impact some of those pedestrian circulation paths that we talked about earlier. So it would make it more challenging for people to move across the park in the way that they're used to currently. It would, in terms of phasing, and this is the benefit, allow both facilities to remain operational during construction, so programming would continue in both locations. The downside of that is that it would be really we think it would be really challenging to deal with construction logistics, and that would be hard for contractors, and obviously park operations would have to be managing around not just an active construction site, but active loading, unloading, and staging areas as well. In terms of cost factors, this one probably has the most potential cost impact because it would be a new site, so it would require all new utilities, all new excavation, and because of the topography of the park, it would require a not insignificant amount of site grading in order to fit the building and the associated outdoor areas in that location. So some of the kind of key pieces of input we got from the stakeholders about this option were really a lot of concern about the views and the impact that putting a big building right in that central area would have on people's experience of passive recreation around the pond and the view from the garden. And again, that played out as well in terms of concern about access. So how easy would it be to walk across the park and access one end of it from the other if you have a large facility in the way? So here is our massive summary slide with all of those things tried to fit all on one slide, which obviously you can read really easily from your council seats. Do you want to wrap it up, or should we do questions?
Yeah, I think we can do questions now. So that concludes the presentation of the 3 site options. Thank you, Leah. So at this point, I'm not sure if you do public comment or questions, but we're here for any questions that you may have.
Let's open it up for comments from the commissioners. Do any commissioners have a comment? Or
And
questions? So
just
just questions first.
And there's just a point of order. So this would just be, general questions and different than what we're being tasked with and things. Okay. There may be a little bit of overlap just because the nature of the discussion, but.
Right, more clarifying questions.
Yeah,
Got it.
we'll try to do the clarifying questions and then have the comments after if there are any public comment. So, Commissioner Kersley.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Thanks again for staff for all the hard work and an excellent job as usual. I have a design question. Was consideration given, I see that looks like the buildings are contiguous or done as an L shape. Was there consideration of having separate buildings depending on the location? I know why why it could be connected for economy, for economic reasons, but was there consideration for having 2 separate buildings?
So I can take the first pass at answering the question. So the design that we're showing you is not necessarily the design that will occur. It's more to demonstrate that we can fit all of the different components into each site. So at this point in time, we haven't decided if it's 2 separate but adjacent buildings. It could be 2-story. It could be partially 2-story. It could be L-shaped. So the configuration you see before you isn't the final option. It was just mostly prepared to demonstrate that we could accommodate everything in a single story because that would take up the most square footage or land area. I don't know if Leah, you had anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, everything you said, yes. So all of those we're assuming that when a site is selected, that the specifics of that site will impact the design, and part of that could be pulling them apart or pushing them together in different configurations. So again, the other thing to note is that there is the possibility that it could be phased, and that's a funding question as well. If we're going to phase the building, that would also impact the configuration. So there's a couple of additional factors that would go into that decision. So we're trying to keep that as open as possible at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Did you have any other questions, Commissioner Kersley?
Me?
Yep.
No.
All right. Commissioner Garland?
Hi, yes, that was an excellent presentation. I have a question, I'd like to understand a little more of these noise issues. It seems an important issue, and I don't really understand it. I mean, I know if you're having a swim meet, you're probably gonna have starting guns going off and people cheering, but it seems like that's gonna go, no matter where you are in that park, you're gonna hear that. So I'm not really sure and also, do we have residents complaining, or I was just curious if you could elaborate on the noise.
Yeah, so in terms of the noise that we heard from the stakeholder, it was primarily from the gardens at Heather Farm, which hosts a lot of private events such as weddings, and they're fairly adjacent to both the aquatic center and the picnic area, both which generate noise. And so one of their primary concerns is trying to buffer some of that noise from any future aquatic center. And so the 3 locations may have varying amounts of noise impact to the farm. We did reach out to the neighborhood association, but they weren't responsive in terms of taking us up on the offer to meet with them. So I don't specifically have any feedback from the residents or the HOA that they that represent the residents there.
And
I don't
is
know.
there really any distinction between the 3 sites and hearing the starting gun for or the cheers? I don't know. They're not very far apart in reality.
Yeah, I mean, for really, really loud noises like meets, you're going to hear it at all 3 sites. I think the issue is how pervasive is it and how sensitive are the things next door. So like if you're playing at a playground and you're sort of aware that there's something going on, that's going to bother you a lot less than if you're having your wedding photos done and something's blaring. So I think it's like there's not going to be noise in one and there will be noise in the other. I think it's a degree, and there will most likely be a noise study that would end up being part. Is that accurate to say? It's possible. It's possible that could be, but as a rule of thumb, like a little bit further, better. Big things in the way, like a building, better. So like that's sort of our operating rule of thumb for this analysis, that if there's room to put a building in between a noise source and a sensitive thing, that would be a benefit. And if we can move it a little further away, that would help.
Thank you. And I did have one other question. My other question is more about the costs. Do you have any sort of ballpark difference between them, or is it, we just sort of interpret it as, well, this is probably more and this is probably less? Is that where we are right now?
Yeah, I mean, at this point in time, we're basically saying all 3 are relatively similar in cost. The cost factors we've identified are the items that would be the differentiators. I'm not sure if, Leah, if you have anything to speak to in terms of if any of the differentiators, such as the grading versus the excavation, is more or less impactful. And you might just want to stay on here.
As a very general rule of thumb, grading and excavating is quite expensive and more expensive than bringing utilities in, which is a little bit easier. As a general rule of thumb, I think at the stage we are in design and not knowing exactly when it's going to be constructed, there's so many factors that are going to influence the cost, and it's likely that at this point the margin of error for escalation and bid contingencies is going to far outweigh any of the site factors, even though they do have an impact.
Thank you.
Commissioner Oller?
Thank you very much for your presentation, both of you, and for all the work that's gone into this. Obviously, significant amount, and will for a long time forward as well, I'm sure. Couple questions. One, if I remember correctly, one of the earliest slides we saw was the boundary of what's under consideration. It appeared to me that the pond was in that zone. Does that mean that the shape of the pond or the footprint of the pond could potentially change?
Yes, great question. So let me first refer to the first part of your question, which is yes, the cement pond is what it's commonly referred to, is included in that area, and that was part of early on in the process. You may recall we put together a number of assumptions about what is untouchable in each of the parks and what is up for potentially being reshaped, relocated, et cetera. And the pond was identified as one of those features that could be relocated, reshaped, et cetera. And so in a couple of the options before you tonight, there could be, once the buildings are actually designed and located, we may find that we need a little bit more elbow room, as I think Leah put it, that could encroach into the pond area and perhaps reshape some of the edges. And what we've identified is that in no case would we impact more than 30% of the pond, so that in any case, at least 70% of the pond would remain.
Okay, that's good to know, because it seems to be, without that flexibility, it makes it even more difficult to arrive at the best solution. Secondly, was there guidance that 3 alternatives would be the number that we would look at, or that was under consideration, or is that just a convention, or what drives, you know?
There's no real magic to 3. It's more than 2, less than 4. It's a good number, but no, really, it's that, you know, when we did the site analysis early on, and we were trying to determine what are feasible locations. Again, this was back in a year or so ago. The feasible location area was fairly constrained, and so once we had that limit, there really just kind of rose up to the top to be 3. Just somewhat obvious locations for where the future facility could be located. But there's no necessary magic to the number of 3.
Okay, great, thank you.
All right, yeah, I had just a couple of questions too. One was just the square footage. So is the current assumption that the square footage of those 2 buildings would be identical to what they are now? And that's being used for the combined buildings?
So let's see, back in phase 1, when we were looking at the building size and we were looking at the different uses or activities that would occur in the buildings, we identified the different uses and the space allocation for each. And at the end of the day, the increase in the building size was fairly minimal. We were trying to keep the overall cost down as much as possible, but we also wanted to accommodate future needs. So there was kind of a balancing act we played there. But we definitely did some right sizing, because a lot of the facilities were undersized, such as the locker room facilities, bathrooms, that kind of thing, that needed to be increased. And then we also added an additional like movement type room. And those were the more, that's where most of the new square footage went. But again, we were trying to keep it fairly minimal to reduce cost.
And then I'm just curious about the considerations. So did you also consider putting the pool where the parking lot is currently, or is the parking lot like one of the unmovable features? Because I just noticed there's a lot of things that have been moved around, but like the parking lot doesn't seem like it's really.
That's
You know,
a good question.
The pool could be built in the parking lot, and then the buildings could be on the outside, and it would protect the sound from the garden people.
Adjacent to All Abilities Playground and the swim center. Can you answer that? Okay.
Well, the really short answer is that the parking lot was not an untouchable thing. So it was mostly that, you know, again, in that site, where if we're trying to fit 2 pools and a building and also maintain some amount of parking, well, 2 things. It's hard to fit something in that parking lot area, because it starts to butt up against the need for access through the drive aisle. So if we're trying to maintain access and a facility and the All Abilities parking lot, it doesn't fit really well in that location. And I think part of that was also trying to not construct new site features that wouldn't need to be constructed. So we could put a totally different entry into the facility and rebuild parking somewhere else, but it wasn't feeling like we got as a really big benefit from doing that, where we get like the benefit that we would get from relocating it roughly in the existing place is savings, and putting it in the parking lot didn't have a big benefit for that. But I guess it's not magic. It just didn't feel like it was giving us a lot of benefit when we started to look at it.
Do any of these plans consider the option of having underground parking?
No. Again, that would be a cost factor that would have pushed us beyond what I think we thought we would be capable of funding for, since underground parking is a big expense.
And then one more question, sorry, but I noticed that this also would affect the sand volleyball court and the basketball area. And so you said it's not going to be creating new amenities, but is the assumption that you'll be preserving existing amenities in other places if they are, there's a building put up on them?
So, right, so if a building is put on an existing amenity, we would need to relocate that amenity, yes.
Right. Any other questions that have come up from the commissioners? Okay, Secretary Ballinger, are there any public comments?
We have one public comment.
And
I'll go ahead and bring in Leo Lynn.
so can you guys tell when the person's, okay. Yeah, so again, public comments are only for the items on the agenda today.
Okay, he's ready.
This is a surprise for me, but I'm glad to participate. I think I like, just as a member of the swim community from both Masters and Walnut Creek, building on the a site other than current will be very helpful, because we went through that very early in the development phase. If we close down the existing pool, none of those programs would likely survive, because if you look at a 1 year or 2 year maximum of construction, there's no place, with such a shortage of aquatic waters, as we call it in the sport, all those programs would probably go away. So I like that approach, and I'm not very clear on one of the chart that you have at the 50-meter pool next to not a rectangular anymore. So is that option means that the warm-up pool or the 25 or supporting pool is going to be irregular shape? I think it's in option 3.
Yeah, we can't answer questions during public comment, I'm sorry, but we can raise
never
that.
mind, sorry.
We can raise that into the future.
Yeah, okay, sorry. That's it I have for now.
All right, well, thank you for your comments.
You're welcome.
May I?
Yeah.
For the
Mr.
record,
Steen?
Kevin Safine, Director of Arts and Recreation. I appreciate the question from the member of the public. Should the commissioners wish to direct that question to staff, we'd be happy to answer that question.
Yeah, if you do have are there any more public comments?
I don't see any additional hands raised.
Okay. There's no members of the public that are in attendance. So I will now officially close public comment. And now we will, if we would love to hear a response from the Director of Arts and Rec, Mr. Safine, if you have an answer about I believe the question was regarding the Middle Park site. It appears from the diagram that the recreational pool does not appear to be rectangular.
Right, and if you want, we can pull up that slide for the commissioner's benefit. But essentially right now, that's not a design. Those are just, if you will, blobs that show potential adjacencies and what the location of the different pools might look like. And so that still is to be worked out. We haven't even considered all the amenities of the non-lap pool. So that is, say, the recreation pool. It could have lanes, it could have a lazy river, it could have other things. So that's still to be determined. One of the things that we will be doing, assuming this project moves forward, is working with the teams and finding out what's the best design to meet the needs of the community, meet the needs of teams, and have a balance there. So I really appreciate the question, and we'll be working on that. Assuming this project moves forward in depth, and we'll bring that back to you for consideration as well. So thank you for asking the question.
All right, thank you. And thank you to the member of the public for raising that question for us. Okay, so now we're going to move on to comments from the commissioners. So if you go to page 6, these are the items that were being requested to provide feedback on. So I think it would be probably best if we could go through each of the items individually, just for consistency, so we could go through and make comments one-on-one. So the first question that they're asking us for our feedback on is, in considering how the options were evaluated, what criteria have we missed that should have been included before staff takes this analysis to council on November 16th? So if you refer to your packets, the criteria were the building configuration, adjacencies, access, circulation, and parking, operations, phasing, and cost factors. So do any commissioners want to make any kind of comment about, are there any additional criteria that we should be including in our analysis before bringing this to council? Okay, Commissioner Oler?
I don't know whether, I can't anticipate what council will ask, but I do wonder whether the cost differences, although described as, in the ballpark, or whatever the exact words were, may be challenged a little bit in terms of how close are we talking about, that type of thing. Cost has always been an important part of this project, and it probably is going to get even more important as we try to figure out ways to fund it. So that could certainly be one thing that arises.
Other comments on the criteria? Commissioner Kearsley?
Speaking of related to cost, when I look at if two of the proposals are under consideration for the community center site or the Middle Park site, one thing it's hard to ignore, or even if it's the Middle Park site and the other two sites are not considered or chosen, is the repurposing of those locations. I think that's a cost that would need to be considered in that. We can't ignore that, if everything is removed from the swim center, for example, and there's an idea because it says about open space, but that's a cost that will have to be considered in terms of what to do with that space. So I think it's under cost factors. I think it is something to consider and should be presented to council such that when they're thinking of the cost, that, again, what do we do with that space? If we do anything with it, it's going to cost something. I have another. Okay. The other is in terms of criteria. Has there been consideration on the, I won't say environmental impact, but the impact on the existing wildlife habitat, certainly during construction and even after construction? So, for example, if the pool is moved over into the middle of the park or the community center, certainly noise considerations for wildlife, particularly the birds that are in the pond and also in the lake. And along those lines, is there any consideration regarding potential discharge, either into the pond, into the lake, into the canal, and that kind of impact that could occur not only during construction but afterwards? So those are just my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Garland, any comments about the criteria?
Only if there is any differentiation among how long it will take to build any of these options. I assume the ones that are in a completely, new area are probably going to take longer. Permits might be different. I don't know, but I'm curious whether that is that a consideration or not.
Commissioner Oler?
I had additional couple of further thoughts. Although it may be less in terms of dollars, the various options include closing part of the programming, either on the community center side or the pool side. And there are revenues associated with that may also be of interest and what that would potentially do. But there's also a human element to it, and it's staffing. You know, it's difficult enough as it is to get lifeguards these days, and when you basically don't have a pool, in the case of the first option, then you don't have any need for lifeguards and other staff related to maintenance and other things. So it's that's a thorny issue that's going to potentially rise up if an option is chosen that shuts down programming for, you know, the 1 or 2 years or whatever it takes to construct the project.
Thank you. Other comments? Yeah, I think the one other just small comment I'd like to make in it is, again, is related to cost. I think to really consider fundraising opportunities, especially for the difference between the 50-meter pool and if they have a recommendation for a 25-meter pool, because I think at our prior years of meetings, we've gotten a lot of feedback from the public that there's a lot of enthusiasm about raising money for a 50-meter pool, but very much less enthusiasm for the possibilities of raising money for a 25-yard pool or meter pool. I don't know. I forget if that one's a meters or yard. So just I wanted to throw that out there as, you know, kind of a fundraising part. Other comments from commissioners? So I think our takeaways, if I just had my notes, maybe I'll just recap what I heard and see if we have anything else. It seems like more detailed breakout of what the costs are and possible fundraising opportunities are, consideration of the environmental impacts to the surrounding areas, consideration of the impacts of programming, both like what will happen with the staffing, what will happen in the meantime, is there an associated cost with relocating the programming, and also the amount of time to develop, basically how long will it take to get this new center up and running. Okay, great. So we'll move on to the second item we're asked to provide feedback on. So I don't think that we need to go through each of the 3 options, but maybe people can just kind of give some input on comments on for each of the options. What do you see as key concerns and key benefits? If you agree with what's already stated, you could just say you agree. We don't need to outline everything, but if you have, you know, other kinds of factors that you really want to amplify or highlight, I think this would be a great time too. So I'm going to open up to my fellow commissioners for comments on key concerns and key benefits of the 3 different options. All right, Commissioner Oler?
Sure. In my mind, the key concern is the continuation of programs. You know, if I accept ballpark as adequate in terms of a funding target, then it really boils down to how do we keep programs going that so many people are involved in on a day-to-day, week-to-week, year-round basis with this major construction underway, and that pushes us towards an obvious choice of options.
Do you want to say more about what site you think would be the most impacted by the programming?
Well, I don't know the numbers, but clearly the aquatics has got to have the predominant number of people involved on a day-to-day basis. Yeah.
Thanks. I just want to make it explicit for the record. Yeah, sure. Thank you. Other commissioners? Commissioner Garland?
Just my preference really is to not go into the heart of the park with a brand new large facility. So my preference, and I agree with you that the swim, that's a big issue of, you know, how do you do this and not stop all swimming? But yeah, I went to the park today and I walked around the 3 sites, and I just think, I just feel like if we keep it on the periphery, I think it's also better with the road structures the way they are to be able to do that as well. So that's.
Commissioner Kaisley, any concerns or benefits?
Well, I mean, again, I think it was already stated and stated well regarding, programming. I mean, at first I kind of dismissed it a bit, saying, well, there are alternatives, but maybe there aren't. In terms of, again, swimming locations, other programs that go on, and where would those be held? What opportunity could there be with that programming in other locations? So certainly has a significant impact. Now, if you were to go to any new area, sometimes there's growing pains, right? Sometimes cities do shut down services so they can build new ones. We've all felt that impact in some form or another where we no longer have a service, but it is certainly a valuable consideration when looking at these different alternatives.
Yeah, thank you. I think you all have raised the issues that were my concerns. I think there's some consensus that I would just want to throw that I agree with, is that it doesn't seem that the middle option is particularly viable. I don't know if that was the straw man, but it seems like that one has a lot of the worst of many worlds in terms of both being, including many views, also requiring a lot of additional building and some access to parking. I think it is a nice that if we do move the whole center to where the community center is currently, that it does open up that back parking lot that's by the solar panels that tends to be a little bit less used right now. Because I know already the other overflow parking is still sometimes overflown when there's also baseball going on, so it's not like it's all empty, but that one parking lot sometimes has some space. So now I just would like to say, so they really want us to be concrete to support 2 out of 3. Maybe people can just rank if you have a strong preference in ranking, and then that will conclude our feedback. So again, they're looking for comments, not consensus. We won't be taking a vote. So this is really just to provide input that they will be taking to council about the recommendation of pros. So would you like to go first?
Sure. So I will go with the community center as my number 1, followed by the swim center, followed by the middle park.
Commissioner Oler, would you like to go next?
Sure, yeah. In terms of my top 2, I would support the middle park as the first option, and the community center is the second option. And I think in either case, the footprint around those 2 options should be broadly thought of rather than narrowly in the way it's currently presented.
Vice Chair Kearsley?
Well, I guess I'm not prepared to rank, but just because I was
Yeah, that's not required.
Yeah,
you
no
could
worries,
just state
no
the 2
worries, I
that
know.
if there are 2 that you prefer. I think
Shoot.
the idea is if there's one you want to take off the list.
Of course, yes. I can certainly, with confidence, emphatically remove the middle park. I think that would be my least favorite. So it would be the swim center, community center. I'm very cognizant or sensitive to existing infrastructure and what can be supported in those areas. And so there are merits to both, and we know that what's not on the table are ultimately all those other cost variables that'll come up. So I'd like to just leave it at the 2 as being my choice. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think I would also, I prefer the community center site just so we could keep the ongoing programming and maybe have some interesting new ways to think of the space around the pool center, and then followed by the pool space. I also just want to give a strong recommendation for the 50-meter pool over the 25-meter pool, because I've heard council is still not 100% sure about that. So if anyone, you have any?
Yeah,
Commissioner Oler?
and we as a commission made that recommendation jointly with the Arts Commission, some time ago.
Yeah, so we have a new commissioner on our program. So I don't know if you want to share any thoughts on the 50-meter versus 25-meter, but if you don't, that's fine as well.
No.
Okay. All right, so I do think we have addressed. Is there any other issues you'd like us to address?
I think you guys, thank you so much for your feedback. I'll just make a couple comments just for clarifying, just for, sharing information. And I'll speak for Kevin Safine from Arts and Rec, and he can chime in here, but the programming at the pool is obviously, and you've mentioned this, is very much more robust than it is at the community center. The community center, if we were to lose that and have to have that facility be down while we were constructing a new facility, which would be much easier to handle. They don't do a lot of programming there. Of course, we'd lose the lakeside room, which would be the, wedding rentals and that kind of stuff. But then beyond that, they just do a few classes and that kind of thing. And then we would have to find a place for staff to be. But that is easier to handle or accommodate than the swim center. And then I'll only say one more thing about the swim center. Some of you might remember this, is that we did do an expansion at Larkey, and it was under the guise of, one, we needed more swim area, but then two, we thought that if we were to ever shut down the pool at Clark, we would have a bigger swim center over at Larkey that could accommodate some of that programming, but by far not all of it. So I just wanted to remind. And then third, I will say that, to your point, these are really, really schematic, and they aren't meant to be where they would be sitting or anything like that. You're exactly right that when we get closer, when we make a decision on kind of where, then all those details will be worked out in terms of how we maneuver and where we put things. And you're right, we would want to spend a lot of time and be very careful about that. And there'll be a whole bunch of public process that will go along with that. And then to the comment on environmental, of course, we'd be looking at environmental, and we'd be doing a whole environmental document, and, we would be obviously thinking about discharges and anything like that that you brought up. We'd be taking care of that. And Kevin's here to say more.
Right. Well, now I'll talk about Public Works.
Sorry.
It's great. Thank you for bringing up those topics. I think it was Commissioner Oler who was asking about numbers. Broadly, I would say for the aquatic facility, you're talking about tens of thousands of people every year. For the community center, you're probably talking about thousands of people. And so if staff were looking at how could we relocate the aquatics program potentially to Larkey, we could not do that. We could conceivably relocate the community center because there are just 2 rooms there. There's the lakeside room, then there's the club room. We could find a way to accommodate those 2 and staff and weddings. Not completely, but more easily than we could if we were to shut down the pool. So we'll explore those options. We'll present some options to council. But I think Director Ballinger is correct that those are things that staff has been thinking about a lot. Is what would the impact be? And so the community center, we could potentially for 2 years up to make that work. The pool would be just very difficult. So thank you. Janine has some closing thoughts.
Thank you. And you have a closing statement?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to highlight what the next steps were. So on November 16th, we'll be going to City Council, presenting the same options that we presented to you tonight, and we'll be layering in your feedback. And then once we have the location set, then our design team can get to work on preparing conceptual level designs for the combined facility. And then simultaneously, our city manager's office is leading the effort to look at a funding strategy and are working with the city council on funding mechanisms for potential, including a potential revenue measure for how to fund the future facility. So those are our next steps, all concluding around June of next year. So that's all I have for you tonight. Thank you again for your clear feedback and thoughtful feedback. It's much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. So the next item on our agenda is commission announcements or brief reports on activities. So do any of my fellow commissioners have any reports on their liaison appointments or any other activities they'd like to raise? Commissioner Garland?
Yes, so I did attend 2 Walnut Creek Open Space Foundation board meetings in my new role as the liaison. And I did, a couple of the highlights, I guess, are, so the foundation is developing a fiscal sponsorship agreement with the Save Seven Hills Ranch Committee. I guess there's a residential development project on a portion of the Seven Hills Ranch property. And the Save the Seven Hills Ranch has issues with that, and then, but they're a little more ad hoc, so they've come to the foundation for support, and so that they're working through that. They're, from a resource standpoint, they were expressed a fair amount of concern about the drought and have noted quite a few impacts in the open space from drought, like loss of mature trees, low acorn crop, things like that. So one of their projects coming up this year, they won't be planting probably acorns, but they will, or seedlings, but they'll be caging the natural recruitment. And they did get a gift of the fencing material. So they're gonna, put that project together this fall. And then, I don't know, Mike, if they sent the letter ever, but they talked both meetings about a letter they were working on that would relate to the flow trail and their position on that and some concerns they have on that. So I don't know if you want to talk about that in your remarks. Yeah. Those are the highlights.
Great, thank you for that report. Any other commissioners want to give a report? Okay. Vice Chair Kearsley?
I just want to thank Leslie Hunt from the Friends of the Creek for her really dedication and hard work. In addition to the Walnut Creek Open Space Foundation, she heads up the Friends of the Creek. And I've had the numerous opportunities to work with Leslie. Most recently, there was a group of people, including myself and my son, who helped with an Orindo clearing project in Walnut Creek by Civic Park, whereby we were removing a non-native invasive plant from the creek, which has been causing a lot of problems, like a lot of non-native species. So there's been that effort. Friends of the Creek is really quite dedicated to efforts like that. They also do tree removal. No tree removal. They plant trees. Just the opposite. Strike that. What they do is they will plant new plants, native plants along the creek in Walnut Creek, as well as Las Trampas and the San Ramon Creek area. They also host trash removal events and so on. And it's really quite a dedicated group of people, but they need volunteers. And people like Leslie and others need help if it's going to continue on. The city does a terrific job, but the city can't do it alone. So, but I do want to thank Leslie again and other volunteers for Friends of the Creek. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Uller, any updates?
Yeah, in kind of a related fashion, Community Service Day last Saturday was a great opportunity for not only Walnut Creek residents, but regional residents to come and work in our parks and our open space. And I just wanted to, anybody that's listening in on this that participated in that, I want to thank them for all the work they did, and thank staff for organizing so many of the activities, and thank the foundations like the Walnut Creek Foundation, Save the Creek, and the Walnut Creek Open Space Foundation, and the other foundations, which I'm sure I won't mention because I don't know all the ones that are involved, but thank them for organizing these activities and helping out. It's a great way to get your hands dirty and do something good for Walnut Creek. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Now we'll move on to staff announcements or brief reports on activities. Do we have any staff announcements?
Good evening, Commissioners. Mike Vickers, Public Works Manager, responsible for Parks and Open Space, and I wanted to add on to Commissioner Oller's comments about Community Service Day. We had another successful Community Service Day. I think this is our 11th in a row. And in terms of the parks and open space, staff runs 2 or 3 of those projects. And then the Hunts, both Leslie and Bill, run several projects out in the open space in Civic Park. And then there was some help over at the All Abilities Playground with the Civic Pride Foundation. And it's interesting because I shared a weekly with council, and I know it went to you folks as well. A couple weeks back, we shared that we have reduced our pesticide use in the last 10 years by about 90%. And it's these activities that the community's contributing to, putting that bark out and pulling the weeds has really helped us reach our goal. We've got a ways to go. We're trying to reduce, get down to that 0 or down to that 5% single digit numbers. But we can't do it without the community, so it's greatly appreciated. In terms of the letter from the Open Space Foundation, that letter was sent. I haven't opened it yet. I've been out of the office for the last couple of weeks, but I know the letter was sent. I just haven't had an opportunity to see the details. And then lastly, the triangle. There was a lot of public comment at the previous meeting regarding the triangle. A number of youngsters, along with their parents, that are trying to activate an area in Acalanes. We have, through the direction of the commission and the drive from the community, we met with them in person. I'm also meeting with them again this week to talk about more details, and either at the December meeting or through weeklies or even the February meeting, we'll come back with some additional details and give you an update on where we're at with that project. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other staff reports? Okay, so I think we're here. I will just adjourn the special meeting on Monday, October 11th of the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Commission, and our next meeting will be on December 6th, 2021, a regular meeting. Thank you all.